For both input and output, so property and event binding, there are some additions to the syntax you already learned. For event binding, the add_output here can take an argument of type string where you might specify a different name which can be used outside of this component. So internal, this property is named clicked. But let's say outside of this, so in the component listening to the event, you want to name this clickable, for example. Then you could go to the data binding component or to the HTML file, to the template where I am listening. And now clicked would no longer work, as I can demonstrate you. Nothing happens because we renamed it to clickable, which is now the outside name of this property. So now this works again. This is a way to have differing names inside of the target component or of the component with the input or output and the external, the other components. However, it is a best practice to not really use that if you don't have to. So you may just leave it like this and use the internal property name as the external one too. The same you just saw for output does of course also work for input. Another thing which you also shouldn't necessarily use is that instead of having add_input in front of each property you want to have as an input, and the same is true for add_output of course, you could add the inputs metadata or outputs in the case of event binding, and then in an array have as strings all the different names or property names you want to use. So for example, you might want to use result here, and this would allow you to get rid of the add_input. Now this would still be set as an input, but you don't have the decorator here, and of course you also don't have to import it from here then. And this should be inputs here, by the way. As you can already see, I'm getting this underlined, and I get an error by TS_lint telling me that this is a bad practice and I should use add_input. The same would be true for outputs. So while you might do this, and you can, it's a better practice to, well, revert this and use the add_input decorator here like before. So with that, you learned how you can let your components communicate with each other, transfer data, listen to events, and so on. Of course, there are other ways too. You will learn about them in the services module, but this is a very powerful and important thing. And property and event binding, as well as string interpolation, are things you will use a lot, really a lot.